So welcome to our afternoon keynote session. Just a couple of notices to start with. There's still time to vote for your favourite poster. Details for how to do that are up on the poster board, so forms up from the desk and hand these back in there. So this year, our lived experience slot goes to a great group of lived experience researchers called Recovery in the Bin. I've been following them on Twitter for a number of years now, and they do absolutely fantastic work. They were our top choice to speak this year. We're absolutely thrilled that they're here. On their Twitter bio, they describe themselves as a user-led, critical theorist and activist collective. So I hope that whets your appetite. So we've got Bethan Edwards and Rick Burgess and Ellie Thomas from Recovery in the Bin. So now over to the voice of lived experience.
I can just do some housekeeping. It's fine if you want to photograph slides and everything to that side, but Ellie here needs to have her privacy respected and have that not shared on social media, so if you could not do that, please. And could you not use a name, just say to the presenter or something. Thank you very much. And on with the show.
You can take photos of us as well. Well, it's a pleasure being here today. Thank you for inviting us to speak. I'm Bethan, and this is Rick, and I'm Ellie, and we're here today on behalf of Recovery in the Bin.
As many of you all know, Recovery in the Bin is a user-led critical theorist group who spent half a decade at least critiquing recovery and making jokes in order to survive.
We are not academics, we are binners. And we came from beyond academia, from a mysterious place you may have read about known as reality. Anecdotal is not a dirty word in our world. Our hierarchy of evidence is lived experience right at the top.
So, our focus and critique is therefore based on our user-led collectives' experiences, which are grounded in the way recovery is understood, researched and implemented with people who have severe and long-term mental health conditions. We are today's grassroots, the very people from whom the recovery vision originally emerged.
In 2014, we began as a small Facebook support group for people who felt abandoned by recovery. The group was founded by 3 mental health survivors who remain integral to our work today.
Since then, we have grown beyond our founders' wildest dreams, which are best not gone into. We have a Twitter account and a blog which has been referenced more than 138 times and growing, including by some of you here today. We even have our very own spokesperson, Rita Binns, who will occasionally make an appearance every so often. Not today, though, possibly. We have listed some of our most notorious blog posts, which you may want to check out later. They include our own Recovery Star and our Stepford Recovery College prospectus.
So, unsurprisingly, we have come to speak to you today about recovery. However, we aren't just going to repeat our familiar critique, which can be found on our internationally renowned blog. Today, we aim to build on this critique by conceptualising or describing what we call neo-recovery.
This will be the first time we've presented these ideas, and so please could you reference this presentation so we can be recognised for our original contribution to knowledge.
As this is a mental health nursing research conference, we're fairly confident that you all know about the existence of recovery. The approach, the concept, the notion, the visual, the model, pick whichever you like. And you should know about some of its faults and flaws, trials and tribulations. So we'll skip the basics of recovery so we can spend more time on our critique.
So, to set the scene a bit, let's just tell you a bit about recovery's emergence in policy. So, in 2001, recovery appeared in English mental health policy and shortly after in the rest of the UK. It reflected Anthony's frequently cited grassroots user-led definition, which originated from people with severe and enduring mental health conditions in the United States in the 1980s and early 1990s. You're probably very well versed now in Anthony's quote, but for anyone who isn't, it's up on the slide for you.
Despite recovery's prominent place in policy in 2001, little was known about what recovery-orientated services would look like or the contextual barriers to implementation in the UK. And importantly for a research conference, there was no robust UK evidence base to support its prominence in policy.
It is also extremely important to note here, and perhaps this is glaringly obvious, but recovery's prominence in policy in 2001 was highly political, and to be more specific, here comes that word, neoliberal. We'll return to the word neoliberalism multiple times. If you're not familiar with the word, it's the dominant political ideology behind most of the big name governments you may care to mention around the world. Its holy trinity, as such, is deregulation, privatisation, and the cutting of social provision, welfare, social care, those sort of things. One description of it is neoliberalism values individual interaction in free markets. It argues for welfare state cutbacks and greater individual responsibility and stresses the importance of opportunity. This in turn underscores particular themes of public attitudes, deservingness, obligation and choice, and downplays others, solidarity and community.
So, recovery was in policy and services had to implement it but had little idea if or how it was possible, and they were perhaps unaware of its politicised nature and the potential harms that it may cause.
So, in the context of confusion and politicisation, neo-recovery seedlings emerged.
Fast forward to the present day. Looking at this slide, I hope you'd agree, the recovery approach has not been an astounding success for service users. At one time we thought we were radical, but it seems actually people are catching up with us. Like recovery itself, our critical stance is now beginning to go mainstream.
18 years later, and we are suffering the consequences of a politicised, poorly defined and understood recovery in policy. We still don't have a shared understanding of what recovery means in practice or what it should look like.
It's widely acknowledged that recovery's implementation in the real world is inconsistent and suboptimal. In fact, the Refocus trial suggests that a UK context poses considerable barriers to recovery's effective implementation.
We still do not have a robust evidence base for widespread recovery interventions, including recovery colleges. That's 18 years after it emerged as policy. As the Mental Health likes to remind us, it takes 17 years for research to enter policy. But recovery has had 18 years as policy, and we still don't have the evidence we deserve as service users.
And finally, until this day, recovery has indeed continued to be politicised, or as some people say, politically co-opted. As one of our members, Robert Della, put succinctly in 2014, recovery has always ever been an empty word that refers to whatever agenda or ideology anyone chooses.
Robert didn't specifically mention neoliberalism, but given his other noticeable survivor works, we are confident that the agenda and ideology of neoliberalism were firmly in his mind.
So, in the context of 18 years of confusion, suboptimal implementation, and political co-option and corruption, we propose that a new and distinct recovery approach emerged, which has so far remained unarticulated. We call this neo-recovery.
The word neo-recovery was coined in 2017, or possibly a bit before, by a co-founder of Recovery in the Bin. We want to make explicit for you this unarticulated and often unconscious approach that significantly influences research, practice and policy in the UK, and is now even packaged and branded for global export.
So, our conceptualisation or description of neo-recovery is in its infancy. However, we propose that neo-recovery is distinct from the recovery vision which originated from grassroots survivors. As you can see, we've created this table to explain what we believe are neo-recovery's key departures from the original grassroots recovery vision.
Let's be clear, we hope services aren't all delivering neo-recovery.
We hope not all interventions currently being researched and evaluated are neo-recovery based.
And we hope that there are informed researchers and services where recovery is being implemented in accordance with its grassroots vision and ethos.
And we recognise that there may be services where only some practices resemble neo-recovery, and there may be researchers and clinicians who don't realise that they are implementing neo-recovery.
We'll now move on to describe these key departures in more detail, paying attention to the differences in recovery and neo-recovery's population, theories, values, beliefs, politics and power dynamics. We'll also talk about the impact these departures have had on mental health services and people who live with severe and chronic mental health conditions, the target population of the original recovery vision, many of whom now feel and are abandoned and excluded by neo-recovery.
So, let's first look at population. It is well known that grassroots visions of recovery were firmly rooted in the lived experiences of people living with severe and enduring mental health conditions.
However, neo-recovery is typically applied in a blanket fashion to all people who use mental health services or experience mental distress. We've seen this blanket application in policy, and we also see this in the 8 principles for recovery colleges and the refocus intervention, which is described as suitable for various diagnoses and all types of community-based adult mental health teams. Service users are also aware of this, as this quote from the service user highlights. The approach has been co-opted by mainstream mental health services as a one-size-fits-all, but it doesn't fit everyone and it's clearly not working.
This shift in focus, it's not problematic if the needs of all are met. However, combined with neo-recovery's additional departures, we argue that there has been a shift or refocus from services and research that meet the needs of those with severe and long-term conditions to those that meet the needs, or some of the needs, of people with mild to moderate and time-limited conditions. Let's move on to these additional departures so we can explain a bit more.
So, reflecting grassroots recovery's grounding in the experiences of people living with severe and enduring mental health conditions, it was deeply embedded in the theories and ideas of the social model of disability, with its emphasis on the total long-term impact of severe mental illness. Now, this included functional difficulties, for example, getting our daily living activities completed, the discrimination and stigma we experience, and the inequalities that we face economically and with poor housing.
Neo-recovery, on the other hand, isn't grounded in a social model of disability. Its key proponents view disability, like symptom reduction, as a facet of clinical recovery. Neo-recovery interventions, including refocus, are founded on psychological theories about attitude and behaviour change, and recovery colleges are based on educational approaches. It seems that recovery's grounding in a social model of disability is something lost to history, like the asylums, but that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
So, what's wrong with the shift in focus? By forsaking a firm grounding in the social model of disability and not fully acknowledging psychosocial disability, neo-recovery interventions do not actively address the substantial long-term societal barriers and social disadvantages that people with mental health conditions experience day to day. A rights-based approach that lacks firm grounding in an understanding of long-term psychosocial disabilities will, like the refocus intervention, be no more effective than usual care for us.
Our Recovery Star highlights our social reality. So we ask, where are the recovery-orientated interventions, conceptual frameworks, campaigns, marches and demonstrations that address the socio-political injustices that people with severe and enduring mental distress experience? Now, we acknowledge that there are some initiatives addressing this, but they are far from widespread. No amount of refocusing or re-education at recovery colleges will remove these injustices. Talking about the social determinants of mental health is insufficient. Actions speak louder than words.
Okay, let's move now to values and beliefs. Reflecting its grounding in the social model of disability, grassroots recovery was heavily critical of oppressive mainstream American values, including rugged individualism, competition, personal achievement, and self-sufficiency. They advocated for a wide variety of services based on alternative values, such as collectivism and cooperation.
However, glancing at the heavily branded and marketised recovery stories, interventions, service innovations and transformations, it is clear that neo-recovery embodies the mainstream values of individualism. We see individualistic buzzwords everywhere: self-management, independence, responsibility.
So what's wrong with this departure? Well, as Tegan eloquently stated in 1988, for some psychiatrically disabled people, especially those who relapse frequently, these traditional values of competition, individual achievement, independence, and self-sufficiency are oppressive.
Programmes that are tacitly built on these values are invitations to failure for many recovery persons.
For these persons, independent living amounts to the loneliness of four walls in the corner of some rooming house.
For these persons, individual vocational achievement amounts to failing one vocational programme after another, until they become to believe that they are worthless human beings with nothing to contribute.
And for these persons, an alternative type of rehabilitation programme and even lifestyle should be available as an option.
Tegan could have been writing today. 31 years later, the oppression, failures, feelings of worthlessness and loneliness continue.
Like we said, we live in the real world. In a real world, some people may never be capable of competitive employment. Some people may always need intensive support to remain independent. Conflating independence with self-sufficiency and then demanding chronically disabled people be self-sufficient is unethical, and it's cruel. Disabled activists never intended independence to be understood as synonymous with a self-sufficient neoliberal ideal. As Disability Rights UK succinctly explains,
The essentials of independent living: the right to choose how your support needs are met, control over your day-to-day life, that you are your own expert on your life, that you should have choice in deciding how your support needs are met, and that you should be able to play a part in society.
Whilst words like independence, personal responsibility and choice sound empowering and self-actualising, in the context of neo-recovery, these humanistic versions of individualism have been distorted to fit the ideals of neoliberalism. Phrases used in everyday clinical practice like reducing dependency and taking responsibility now reflect government neoliberal attitudes, particularly in relation to economic efficiency, welfare reform and welfare to work. We have developed some artwork to protest. Take responsibility.
we're now blamed for our failures to recover within prescribed timescales and our inability to conform to the neoliberal ideals of self-sufficiency and so forth, embodied in neo-recovery. We're called dependent, discharged from services, and some of us are re-diagnosed with personality disorders for not getting better. Individualism at its most cruel.
Closely connected to neoliberal individualism and another key departure from grassroots recovery is neo-recovery's overemphasis on positive psychology, or as Woods and others say, compulsory positivity. It's important to remember that grassroots recovery maintained that negative thoughts, emotions and experiences like anger, failure, despair, denial, anguish were key features of the recovery process, alongside positive thoughts, emotions and experiences like hope and optimism.
In contrast, Neorecovery places positive psychology centre stage, and success and positivity appear compulsory. CHIME, the most cited recovery conceptual framework, which has significantly influenced practice, neglects these essential processes in favour of hope and optimism. The refocus intervention formulaically prioritises individualised, future-orientated goals and seeks to assess and amplify strengths. But little room is afforded to our real struggles, difficulties, failures and our past.
So let's tell you what's wrong with this departure. Optimism, inappropriately administered, was seen by grassroots proponents as a significant hinder to the recovery process. And we absolutely agree. Deegan advocates for flexible services that don't abandon those of us who need long-term support in our suffering. Sometimes we need time to be mad. We need support when we, like Deegan, feel anger, failure, denial, anguish, and despair. But we're still abandoned for days and weeks, months and years. Far too often we remain alone.
A quote from our co-founder, Mad Doggy, highlights the invalidation inflicted by inappropriate optimism. They say there's celebrity recovery. There's no room for madness anymore. People used to be actively psychotic and in emotional pain on stages at conferences. Now we must be sanitised normals. We reserve the right to be in a state of unrecovery.
So, our next proposed key departure centres on who controls or leads mental health services, research, or indeed alternatives to these. As everyone by now should be aware, recovery originated from the grassroots, people living with severe and enduring mental health conditions or distress. They advocated for user-led, democratic and collective alternatives to medicine and professional dominance.
However, it's undisputable that mental health services remain controlled and led by professionals. On a concrete level, resources have not been redistributed to user-led alternatives. For example, the National Service User Network's 2019 campaign, called The Value of User-Led Groups, highlights that many user-led alternatives struggle to survive with a lack of funding and often go under.
Peer worker roles are becoming more prevalent, but traditional power imbalances remain, with a lack of equality of pay, influence or career progression for peer workers and researchers. Ask yourselves, are peer workers paid as much as you? Or are they on zero-hour contracts or on non-permanent contracts?
Neorecovery pervades the recovery research industry, just as it does in clinical services. Where are the democratic, user-led studies on recovery interventions or services? How many of the NIH are funded? We couldn't find any. Randomised control trials and systematic reviews led by professionals, reporting on primary studies led by professionals, dominate hierarchies of evidence, and complex interventions proliferate and facilitate professorships.
This is in direct contrast to the democratic nature of grassroots recovery, and it starts that recovery is an elusive phenomenon that evades psychiatric, psychological and scientific language and measurement. It's an experience that cannot be quantified or manualised. We know what it is because we experience it, so please listen to us.
What's wrong with this departure is it's clear that the traditional power imbalances that grassroots recovery strongly opposed continue to exist. Neo-recovery services and research are based on psychological theories of attitude and behavioural change, and educational theories. They are not embedded in our theories or values or those of grassroots recovery, which are collectivist and use the social model of disability. Democratic and collectivist services are virtually non-existent. Services are not emancipatory.
So, Neorecovery prioritises professional policy and service-driven aims and outcomes. These include discharge, reducing dependency, work as a health outcome, and return on investment. These are not our outcomes or our aims. Like grassroots recovery, we firmly believe that subjective experiences of living well should be the primary outcome and concern of all mental health services. We will tell you when we are living well.
Okay, so we talked earlier about how neo-recovery distorts and misuses language. In neo-recovery, recovery becomes an obligation and sometimes an aggressively promoted demand from professionals. It's the same old paternalistic attitudes that professional knows best, but this time it's couched in the language of empowerment and independence.
A significant consequence of neo-recovery's professional status quo is the emergence of what Bridget McWade calls key figures and their spheres of influence. These key figures have access to material and institutional power. Their dominance, as she states, has led to the marginalisation of grassroots definitions of recovery and the exclusion of mad people.
This material and institutional power is prominently seen in the various recovery consultancy services on offer and in the recovery research industry. The Refocus trial is the most widely known and cited randomised controlled trial of a so-called recovery intervention. It received £2 million from the NIHR, but it was no more effective than usual care on all service user outcomes. Okay? I'll repeat that. The Refocus intervention was no more effective than usual care for service users. It's £2 million, really well spent.
The final departure we'll discuss today is neo-recovery's political bias. While we spoke about the influence of neoliberalism several times so far, we need to examine this feature in a bit more detail. It's important to remember that grassroots recovery emerged as a critical response to political and practice failures in the aftermath of deinstitutionalisation and to clinical recovery. It was highly critical of social injustices inflicted by politics and policy which neglected people with long-term mental health conditions in the community.
However, neo-recovery does not critically respond to and perhaps unconsciously colludes with policy and political injustices that impact on mental health services and people with mental health conditions. Welfare reform and austerity are some of the biggest political injustices of our time for people living with mental health conditions. Like recovery's original grassroots proponents, we too are being neglected in the community by policy and politics, yet neo-recovery's silence is deafening.
So, what's wrong with this departure? Well, as Bridget McWade also eloquently asserts, grassroots recovery has been politically neutralised by the very institutions it sought to challenge. We are the grassroots, and neo-recovery has neglected our calls for social justice and collectivist action.
Since recovery emerged in policy, key figures and influencers were quick to align their visions of social inclusion and later recovery to government policy. This alignment with neoliberal policy, particularly with welfare to work and work as a health outcome policies, has continued.
A current example of such complicity is the continued emphasis placed on our right to work above other rights that are by far more important to us and in fact to non-mad people too.
So this is not an isolated quote. Key influencers frequently promote the importance of work, often alongside neoliberal statements about making a contribution to society and portrayals of work as the most significant way of achieving personal fulfilment.
We'd ask this team of key influencers to reconsider their statements and continued emphasis on our right to work above all else in light of the mounting evidence from, amongst others, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the United Nations Rapporteur on Housing, the United Nations Rapporteur on the Convention of Rights of People with Disabilities, and the United Nations Rapporteur on Poverty. And that mental health conditions are actively harmed by punitive welfare reform and its catalyst, austerity.
The work capability process has been associated with 590 suicides, 279,000 additional cases of reported mental health problems, and 725,000 additional prescriptions for antidepressants in areas where higher reassessments were reported. People with a mental health condition are 2.4 times more likely to lose their existing DLA entitlement when transferring to personal independence payment compared to physical conditions.
The deaths of our peers, colleagues and allies continue to escalate through lack of appropriately resourced services under austerity and punitive, coercive and degrading welfare reform. The number of people out of work is not our fundamental injustice.
So, before we conclude, it's worth reflecting on the cumulative impact Neorecovery's key departures, which we've discussed today, have had on the original population for which recovery was intended, those with severe and enduring mental health conditions.
Sweeping recovery policies and interventions for all, which are underpinned by educational, attitude and behaviour change theories, in the context of neoliberal individualism and compulsory positivity, have meant that neo-recovery caters for the norm, the socially acceptable, and the majority who have mild to moderate conditions.
So this departure is confirmed by the endless redistribution of resources from inpatient and secondary care to primary care, and the prioritising of low-intensity, short-term, low-cost interventions. The closure of wards and day centres in the name of recovery is commonplace, and it's rightly identified by slaves and others as an abuse of recovery. Think about, where has the money for recovery colleges been taken from? Who is not getting a service now? Whose needs are no longer being met?
Short-termism, low-cost and standardised interventions for all reflect neoliberal individualistic ideals of self-sufficiency, and its mantras that everything is within your reach if you just try hard enough. This sets people with long-term psychosocial disabilities up for failure. These services and interventions mimic the prescriptive, linear, mechanistic process from A to B that grassroots recovery opposed, because it does not afford flexibility for complex and long-term needs.
Grassroots recovery, including Deegan in 1988 and Anthony in 1993, actively advocated for a comprehensive community support system and an increase in long-term support. 18 years since recovery became policy in the UK, and 31 years since Deegan spoke about her experiences alongside other grassroots survivors, we'd like to ask, where are the long-term, flexible, alternative services and support based on collective values?
Where's the increased investment and comprehensive community support systems that Anthony spoke about so many years ago?
Where are the democratic, truly user-led services?
So today we can't point to Victorian crumbling buildings to symbolise our confinement, ill treatment and exclusion from society today. Neo-recovery is much more insidious. Like grassroots recovery, our confinements are ideological and politically sanctioned, but they are hidden and they are elusive. Neo-recovery promises to uplift and protect us, whilst simultaneously taking away our dignity, support and safeguards in the name of independence. An independence we are not allowed to self-determine.
If material and institutional power remains with key professional figures, grassroots notions of recovery will forever be sidelined, affording very little voice or room to those of us who are mad, and also mad about the way recovery has been co-opted, hijacked and distorted beyond recognition.
So, as mental health nurses and researchers, we ask that you stay true to the original recovery vision. Remember the grassroots, those of us with severe and enduring mental health conditions. Please don't abandon us to neo-recovery.
By the time recovery colleges are crumbling buildings, it will be too late. So thank you everybody for inviting us to speak, and you've been a wonderful audience, well behaved, and we hope that you like us, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Oh, I'm sure you agree that was fantastic. I'm sure there might be lots of questions, so hands up and I'll... Oh, yes.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. Really, really enjoyed it. So I've been qualified for 12 months. So I just want to, I don't know if you're in the business of giving advice, but I'm going to ask you some advice. Or something along those lines. So there's this theory called capitalist realism, which is that neoliberalism has robbed us of the ability to imagine society any differently to the way that it is now. And I think that what you've articulated as neorecovery is basically that, but what's happened in mental health services. So in my training, I was told that that's what we do. We do recovery, we help people recover. And it's like that story of the old fish swims past the two young fish and says, how's the water? And the two young fish say, what's water? Because that's just what I've been around. So how can people who have grown up in that system, have been coming through the system now as professionals, how can we start to try to think differently about how we help?
Well, I think it's really hard, actually. I'd never even heard the word neoliberalism until I joined Recovery in the Bin, so it's been quite a political awakening, I have to say. I think it's down to your lecturers to familiarise themselves with critiques like ours, make sure you're trained in it. I also think everybody who's a practitioner or a researcher should be looking at what service users and user-led groups are saying. And if you do that, this is what we're saying. You'll find out about it.
I'd say like a quick slogan is, recovery was gentrified into neo-recovery, just like our cities were gentrified into whatever the hell they are now. And I mean, if you just want one simple answer, just go and read The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. And then also bear in mind that we're at this point, you've got Extinction Rebellion shutting down cities. We have to change, otherwise we're going to go extinct. So we don't actually have the choice. We have to imagine a different way.
I'd also suggest, so as Ellie mentioned, lecturers, and also you can share with your colleagues, go back to the original grassroots. Ellie came to stay with me for 4 days, and we thought, right, let's go back and see what they were saying. And it was a most humbling and profound experience, I think, for us, because we realised that they were saying exactly what we were saying. So I think it's well worth revisiting what Deegan said, looking at Anthony's work in 1993 and the others around that grassroots movement, sharing that literature with your peers and colleagues, because I honestly don't think they're aware of what the true grassroots advocated for. I think people are taught recovery and that's what they think it is, but its departure is so great from what the grassroots were arguing. So go back to the grassroots.
Thanks very much for brilliant and sort of provocative talk. I think I'm one of the guilty party. I work in nurse education and research. I just wanted to ask you, you've obviously advanced a political critique. What for you is the political action that flows from this critique?
Well, I think really the professionals, academics, should actually take a lesson from community organising, because it's very difficult to be one person speaking out, but if you start working together, you can make that change happen. Organised collective action is the only thing power doesn't know how to deal with. And I would say that if you do that, if you form, more progressive thinking networks, and that you ally with service users, and again, go back to the grassroots stuff. I mean, just as a quick sideline, we had the archive launch of the Great Domestic Coalition of Disabled People, who I work for. And we had books from the 70s and 80s, material, and literally reading those things, I could have just put 2019 on them. We've suffered a regression and a corruption of stuff, and we're talking about things that were talked about 40 years ago.
I just wanted to add that obviously it's taken us an awful long time to describe and conceptualise our neo-recovery and the key departures. And when we were timing this, we didn't feel that we had enough time to go into, well, be more specific about what you could do. And we did say our critique is in its infancy. This is the beginning. This is a platform where we now can go and start thinking, what do we want services and professionals to do, and how would it look? So we are open for people to approach us to discuss how things like moving things like this forward would look like. So yeah, it's an invitation for you to get in touch with us.
And I'm going to be blunt here, don't vote Tory.
Or Brexit Party.
And on that note, thank you so much. That's a really wonderful contribution. So we're now going to head off to the next concurrent